This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. Man, these Olympic Games are delivering. Am I right? The level of competition is extraordinary. The scenery, the intrigue, and the drama. Whew! Loving it. Plus, I've been inspired to dive into French folklore, especially as it relates to their famous cryptids. Because for every Bigfoot and Chupacabra that we have here in North America, Europe, and France in particular, have their own. And hopefully you'll be as delightfully surprised as I was when it comes to the French origins of some of the most famous mythological beasts in history, as well as some really weird ones. So, cook up a crepe, throw on a beret, and turn up the Edith Piaf. Is that stereotypical enough? No disrespect intended. As we take a brief journey through the weird and wonderful world of the monsters of France. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to part 2 of the Paris Olympics special episodes. Okay, so another quick hit today as part of our summer series. Today, as mentioned, we'll be discussing some of the most famous French cryptids and their unlikely place in the American mythological canon. First, here's what we won't be discussing, and not because they're not interesting, but just because I think some other things are more interesting. Who knows? Maybe we'll circle back in future episodes. Okay, so we won't be covering the Beast of Gévaudan. And please excuse my awful French speech affectations. They're more for me than for you. The Beast of Gévaudan is actually thought to be responsible for more than 113 deaths back in the 1700s. The French government actually investigated the attacks thought to have been perpetrated by one or more wolf-like beasts that tore out the throats of adults and children alike. There are artists' renderings, but no actual evidence that such a beast ever existed. I include the beast here as an honorable mention for its similarities to our beloved Chupacabra. We also won't be covering gargoyles, despite the obvious French connection. Okay, briefly, what I found most interesting was that the legend around the gargoyle is your basic slaying of the dragon myth. The origin story concerns a guy named Saint Romanus, former chancellor of Rouen, who delivered that land and its besieged people from a terrible monster called Le Gargouille. Sorry. It was your run-of-the-mill dragon, a winged demon with a long neck, a spiky tail, and the ability to breathe fire. This beast was laying waste to the countryside, and Saint Romanus was able to subdue the creature very famously with a crucifix and return it to the town center where it was burned to death. And according to legend, every part of the dragon burned to ash except for the neck and head, as they had become tempered by the beast's own fire breathing. So St. Romanus decided to mount the head and neck on the newly built church to scare off any further threat from other dangerous beasts that might be lurking in the area. The design element stuck, and today, as we all know, architectural gargoyles can be found on churches across the globe. But instead of warding off evil spirits, another utility was discovered for these objects: rainwater diversion. Yeah, the once proud and terrible dragon now sits at the terminus of the gutters on a church. Alright, so I guess we did kind of cover those two cryptids, but we can still come back to them. But I will not cover the Quinotaur. It's kind of like the Minotaur with the body of a man and the head of a bull, but with 5 horns, hence the Quino prefix, and the body of a sea creature. Yeah, something about Neptune raping the Minotaur. No thanks. So in the late 12th century, French poet Chrétien de Troyes wrote an epic poem entitled Percival, the Story of the Grail. It was obviously a Christian tale about the search for the cup of Christ. However, buried deep within the prose is the following stanza. Quote, "And it is written that he will come again to all the realms of Logres, which was formerly land of ogres, and destroy them with that lance." Right there, in the second to last line, is the first known literal reference to an ogre. You know, like Shrek.
I live in a swamp. I put up signs. I'm a terrifying ogre. What do I have to do to get a little privacy?
Oh no. Oh no.
No! No! What are you doing in my swamp?
So what exactly is an ogre? There is some speculation that the word ogre was originally what early French people called the early citizens of what would become Great Britain. But there's also as much evidence against that as there is for it. I include it here because I think it's kind of funny, and very telling that mainland Europeans considered the land just across the channel to be filled with large, human-eating monsters just waiting for some fresh meat to arrive on their shores. So ogres are widely considered to be a French literary creation with a few descents, this being the word hongra, which could be the root of ogre and translates directly to Hungarian, or the Italian word orco, which means demon. But yes, that's what an ogre is generally considered to be. A giant humanoid creature with a wild mane of hair, incredibly strong, incredibly violent, and with a particular dietary fondness for eating human babies. There's a beautifully dark and macabre engraving by French artist Gustave Moret entitled Puss in Boots Before the Ogre that depicts a brutally detailed scene that casts an ogre very much in the style of a Tudor king and Puss presented as a royal subject. There's a lavish banquet laid out. At least it seems lavish until you give it a second glance. The baskets and cauldron and trays of food consist entirely of unprepared animal parts, just limbs and heads of cows and goats, even a ram's head. And there on the table, just within reach of the beast, is a tray of human babies. It's unsettling, if not beautiful in its composition and rendering. Across the centuries, there has been a cross-pollination of literary giants and folklore-created ogres, to the point where they share so many characteristics that it's difficult to tell them apart. Jack and the Beanstalk had a giant that wanted to eat humans, which is a very ogre-ish trait for a giant. And we can go all the way back to Greek mythology with the Cyclops, a one-eyed giant that was culinarily desirous of Odysseus and his men. And for all of us who are fans of the Shrek movies, we know that ogres prefer to be left alone and are usually found living the solitary life of a shunned, human-eating giant in the forests and swamps of medieval Europe. And interestingly, for all the violence and eating of humans, ogres are generally found in kids' fairy tales, right alongside gleeful fairies and angsty young princesses. But as much as I love Shrek, my favorite thing about the franchise is, in my opinion, a far superior film, Puss in Boots, known in France as Le Chat Botté. Still, you got to admit, the Shrek franchise was the best thing to happen to ogres ever. The wonderful performance by Mike Myers went a long way to humanize an otherwise cold, violent, and rather disgusting outcast who lived in a swamp and wanted, above everything else, to be left alone. It was a fantastically pulled off reframing of the classic "don't judge a book by its cover" moral. And our last cryptid of the day is what's known simply as a wild man, not just in France, but across Europe. Since medieval times, there have been reports of what is known as, well, a wild man. The descriptions vary, but generally, we're talking about a creature larger than a human, covered in hair, and without the ability to speak. These creatures are believed to inhabit large, undeveloped woodland areas, far from human activity. Also, wait a second. France has Bigfoot? Oh, come on. It's nothing sacred. Unfortunately, yes, reports of an ape-like beast have been documented since before Columbus accidentally landed in the Bahamas. And similar to our Bigfoot, the accounts are all pretty much the same. The big difference is that back then in Europe, they had great artists. So even though it all began hundreds of years before the invention of the camera, much like with the wolf-like chupacabra creature, there are artists' depictions based on eyewitness accounts that can be considered contemporaneous, which is pretty interesting if you think about it. But before we get all jealous of the French for inventing Bigfoot, the more I dug into it, the more I understood that, like so many other myths, religious and otherwise, tales of a wild ape man go just about all the way back to our earliest recorded histories, including, if I may backtrack for a quick second, Grendel. From the epic story of Beowulf, Grendel could be considered an ogre. But back to Bigfoot and the origins of that mythical beast, it can be argued that the ancient Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh and the character Enkidu is the very first wild man in any literature at all. Centuries later, Pliny the Elder, the Roman polymath, in his book Natural History, describes a race of what he calls Silvestries, ape-like humanoids covered in hair, violent in nature, and they roamed the mystical lands that we know today as India. So, Bigfoot isn't ours. He probably has European ancestors like many of us do. But, also, like the rest of us, it's more likely that he's a product of the Fertile Crescent. Or, at the very least, a fertile imagination from the cradle of civilization. More next week from my current obsession with all things France. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You could also follow our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.